on this webinar. All right, welcome. So great to have you with us today. Um, this webinar today is part of Rethink's summer training series focused on polling and data. If you missed last week's session on understanding and interpreting polls, please do reach out to us and we can send you a recording and some additional resources from that session. And next week, we will conclude the series with a training on incorporating polls into your media and communications work. Same bat time, same bat channel, just 1 week later. So let's get started with today's session, which will focus on presenting data, really how to talk to non-experts, that is normal humans, about numbers. And as you'll see, that can and often does apply to poll numbers, but we'll also be applying these skills to a lot of other kinds of numbers. So I am your host, Eva Galenas Rosenbaum. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in San Francisco, and I'm Rethink's Chief Operating Officer, and I oversee our research team. And our wonderful Associate Director of Research and Analysis, Adrienne Lynette, is joining me kind of behind the scenes to watch the chat. There will be a fair bit of interactive kind of opportunity for y'all today in the chat. So, and Adrienne will be front and center in next week's session. One more note about the chat. If you have questions that we'll get to at the end, please put those in the Q&A widget so that we don't miss them, because as I say, there are going to be a number of opportunities for you to be kind of interacting with the material in the chat. And if you ask questions there, we'll probably miss them. So make sure to put questions in the Q&A and we'll have time at the end to look at them. All right. So we have folks joining us today with a wide range of professional titles, organizational affiliations, and issues that you work on. You might be a professional communicator and you might not be. When you are professionally communicating about a political or a social issue, you often have to talk about numbers and data, whether that's the amount of money a corporation donated to a super PAC or the percentage of BMEMSA Americans who participate in community organizations, or the cost of a fighter jet that even the Pentagon doesn't actually want. But even if your job isn't primarily about communication, you probably do have to communicate to others. If you're a policy analyst, your job involves conveying your thoughts and recommendations about policy options to elected officials, constituents, colleagues. If you're a researcher, you have to talk about your findings to the stakeholders of your research. If you work in finance or administration, you have to tell people about the balance sheet and your projections. If you work in philanthropy, you have to talk about the impact of your grants. The point is that inevitably, you have to talk about numbers at some point. So in today's session, we're going to look at 3 different aspects of communicating about numbers. We're going to start in what might be a little bit of an unusual place, which is with the core elements of storytelling. And I know that might seem like it's the opposite, or certainly not related to communicating about numbers. That's why we're starting there. So hold on. Then we're going to talk about how to actually talk about data in an effective way. And we'll end with the more visual side of things, how to show data in an effective way. So I promised that storytelling was relevant to communicating about numbers. So let's get into that. Now, we as humans are story-oriented creatures. As much as we like our brains to work in a different way, the most effective way to remember something is really not through flashcards or drills or other kinds of memorization exercises. The most effective way is actually to put it in a story, to give it plot and to give it meaning. Fortunately, that actually works in our favor in other ways as well. So there are 3 useful elements to effective storytelling that we're going to talk about today: repetition, pictures, and structure. We can use each of these elements to tell more effective stories about numbers. So let's go through them one by one. If you've spent any time with young children recently, you know that young kids love to watch the same movies or read the same books over and over and over and over and over. In fact, even if you haven't spent any time with young kids recently, you probably have a book or a movie or maybe a song from your childhood living rent-free in your brain, even as an adult. Repetition helps us move things from our short-term to our long-term memory. And we need to hear things multiple times to hold on to them. The first time we hear it, the picture in our head is often really fuzzy. It's kind of hard to remember it later. But over time, the picture gets clearer and clearer until it's cemented in our memory. Repetition is why we remember commercials, jingles, taglines. It's why tropes are tropes, why references and memes actually work. Repetition is why many of us on this call will recognize this Grey Poupon commercial from the 80s and 90s. And it is also why Kendrick Lamar includes a reference to this commercial in his Humble video, which I think younger members of our of our audience may not have even caught as a reference, but it is a reference to this thing that was on TV for many, many years. Repetition is important for communicating about data because people will generally not remember the numbers that you're telling them unless and until they hear them many times. But we can use repetition to help them stick. Each time you learn or you hear something, you're able to retain and recall it more completely and more accurately, which is what this graphic is trying to illustrate. So the forgetting curve gets a little bit shallower and shallower. Now, the second useful element of storytelling is pictures. Humans are not just storytelling animals, we are visual first processors. Consider how long we were communicating before we developed writing. Our brains are really honed on these visual elements. Now, unlike many other animals, we're heavily attuned to our sense of sight. And we even use idioms in English and in many other languages with sight metaphors in our everyday speech that illustrate this idea of how primal sight really is to us. For example, seeing is believing. He's lost sight of the goal. Love at first sight. I'll look for your email next week. A sight for sore eyes. Now, how many of you read a magazine by flipping through and looking at the pictures? Yeah, I do that too, of course. And even if you do read, often what you're reading the most is the captions on the pictures, not the full article. According to advertising guru David Ogilvy, captions are read 2 to 3 more times than body text. The most vivid stories, which is another visual metaphor, are the ones that we see, either literally or figuratively. So whether it's a movie or a picture book or just a really well-described novel, we usually hold on to the imagery from a story much more than the actual words. Now, let me prove it to you. I'm going to give you 3 images, and in the chat, I want you to tell me what story I am illustrating with these images. Yeah, okay, great. My test worked, yes. The story is Cinderella, and in fact, I'll bet you would only need the center image to tell me what this story is, right? The lesson here about communicating data more effectively is that we can use pictures to help us make numbers stickier for people. And as we'll see, sometimes that means communicating with words that are vivid and illustrative. Other times it means using a literal picture. The third element of storytelling that I find really useful here is structure. Now, stories have elements that are designed to capture and hold attention, and these elements really haven't changed over most of human history. They introduce conflict and stakes. We have heroes and villains, rising action. We have major obstacles and twists, challenges that arise. There's a climax, and then there's a resolution. Now, again, we are storytelling creatures, so we're really attuned to those elements. We can take in and retain information much more easily when it comes in the form of a story. And we pay closer attention when we want to find out how a story ends. We don't like open loops in our brains. So let's simplify that to just a basic story arc, which has three main components. There's the setup, where we introduce the situation, the hero, the villain. We have rising action that leads to a confrontation or a climax, where we see the conflict, the most gripping part of the story. And then we have, very importantly, the resolution, where the conflict is resolved and the built-up tension is eased. And that is really key for our brains. Now, data by itself isn't compelling to most people. We need to tell a story about it. So I'll give you an example. Actually, I'm going to give you two. The first one is, lots of women work in the nuclear arms control and disarmament community. In fact, many of you joining us today are women who work in this field. They're smart, they're capable, they occupy similar expert positions to their male colleagues. However, many women in this space feel that they are not getting as much media attention as their male colleagues. So this is a hypothesis. They feel this way. It's a testable hypothesis. And we at Rethink looked for data to investigate whether this is true. The resolution in this case, in this data story, is that the data shows that in 2022, the ratio was 80% men to 20% women from arms control and disarmament orgs quoted in news stories about nuclear weapon issues. Now, some of the best data stories lead to more questions. In fact, I would say most of them do. More conflict, another round of rising action, ideally more resolution. So in this case, there are lots of questions that come up for me. A couple of them are there an equal number of women and men working in the nuke space? If there aren't, let's say it's 75-25. Then what is our goal? What are we shooting for? Should we be trying to get to parity or representativeness, or what is the most important piece here? Another question is, has this ratio been changing? You can kind of see some hint of that in this graph, but it ends in 2022. So has it changed more recently? Has it gotten better? And that relates, of course, to some advocates' efforts to change this ratio. Another question, is it different for different outlets and journalists, or is it kind of uniform across the whole media landscape, et cetera, et cetera? Now, there are a couple of elements missing from this story, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes. But before I get to that, here's another version of a data story. And you can place a piece of data, like a poll result or a bit of media analysis, like in that last one, really anywhere in the story, depending on what you want your audience to feel or do. Now, for a great example of a data story about polls, let's look at an example from NPR. In this case, this piece from Stephen Fowler on Morning Edition last week, and there's a version of it online that they called "Here Comes the Sun Belt." With Harris running, the presidential map has shifted back. Now, as with many stories, the segment not only begins with the lead, which is actually the resolution, but the title of it, which of course listeners on Morning Edition wouldn't have heard because they don't read the title of the story, but if you're reading it, you actually get it in the title. This is the lead of the story. And news stories will often tease with a resolution that sounds interesting, making you then want to find out the rest of the story. But in any case, after the lead, Stephen Fowler, the reporter, tells us that with fewer than 100 days until Election Day and significantly less time until early voting starts, both the Harris and Trump campaigns are primarily focusing on the 7 states decided by narrow margins in 2020. Now, 4 years ago, Biden narrowly won all of those except for North Carolina. So that's kind of our setup. That's the context. The confrontation climax kind of part of this, where the data comes in, is that after the Biden-Trump debate a month ago, polling averages showed that Biden was losing to Trump nationwide, and he was trailing outside the margin of error in every battleground state except the so-called blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These are familiar things to all of you. And now, with Harris replacing Biden as the likely Democratic nominee, early surveys show a changing contest that's much closer. So we actually have two pieces of polling data that are like the crux of this story. And then, of course, we already know the resolution, but there's a little more detail here. So the changes in this contest, Fowler tells us, are driven by a surge in Democratic enthusiasm. And Harris is winning back younger, non-white voters who had kind of soured on Biden. Now, those shifting coalitions point to improved chances for Democrats in the more diverse Sun Belt swing states of Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada. And they put the original battleground map, which is that first thing that we were seeing in the setup, back into place. Now, Fowler then elaborates by citing the latest NPR PBS News Marist poll, which shows a statistical tie between Harris and Trump, several state-level polls in swing states that show a tighter race since Harris announced her candidacy, and goes on a bit more about some of the demographics as well. So there's actually more of a data story here than it even appears at first. One really important piece to note here, though, is that although Fowler is actually talking a lot about data, this is really a data story. He never cites specific polling numbers. He tells you where the poll is from and when it was conducted. And so you could go look for it yourself. You could find those numbers. But the point that he's making with the polling numbers is already made to you in the way that he talks about the poll. He's giving you, the listener or the reader, the analysis of the poll itself. So it's a data story, but it doesn't have any numbers at all, which makes it a little bit easier for people to follow. So now it is your turn. In the chat, we're just going to take a moment for this. I want you to tell me a data story about, I'm going to give you some stats in just a moment. I want you to tell me a data story in 3 sentences or fewer. Don't spend a lot of time on this. This doesn't have to be perfect. This is your first go at it. And I think most of you don't even work on this issue that this poll is about. But this is a recent poll from Gallup, and the poll was of LGBTQ plus adults in the United States. And one of the things that it found is that adults in the youngest age bracket, 18 to 29, came out at a median age to their loved ones at the age of 17, median age of 17. Those in the middle age brackets between 30 and 64 came out in their early 20s. And those aged 65 and older came out at a median age of 26. So there's some differences there. And I want you to just try telling me a data story about this in 3 sentences or fewer in the chat. Okay, we've got at least one. Okay, some brave folks are coming in with their stories. Yeah, so I'm seeing a couple of different takes on this already, which I love. So some people are saying younger generations of LGBTQ plus people are coming out at younger ages. Yes, great story. Another take on this is that data shows that LGBTQ plus members of our society are more accepted. Yep. Coming out at younger ages than ever. Youngest adults came out before adulthood. Yep. Yeah, these are great. Excellent. Okay, you can keep working on these. I'm going to move us on because there are more opportunities for you to try this out. So, all right, so now we're going to talk about how to actually talk about data. We have a structure for presenting it, which is this story arc, and some of you were already experimenting with that, which is great. But there are a few things that can make our data stories a lot better, that is more comprehensible and more persuasive to our audiences. So the 3 elements that I'm going to talk about are make it real, make it relatable, and make it matter. And we'll start with the first one. So one problem when talking about data, talking about numbers, is that they seem really abstract. Now, this may seem counterintuitive because we talk about numbers as being specific and real and concrete. We'll say something like, that's just theory, let's see some data. But the truth is that most people go through school believing that math class won't actually apply to real life. I think some of you were reflecting that in your comments at the beginning. And many people don't really deal with numbers in their everyday lives beyond buying things and paying bills. So this can be a real problem when we want to communicate something with or about numbers, especially big numbers. Big numbers present a particular problem. So to illustrate what I mean, let's take an example. Let's take voter fraud. So one data set shows that there have been just over 1,200 cases of vote fraud in all forms, resulting in 1,100 criminal convictions over the past 20 years. Of these, 204 involved the fraudulent use of absentee ballots. 143 resulted in criminal convictions. Okay, so that's a lot of data. It's five different numbers in this one, two-sentence statement. Now, to most people, this means virtually nothing. It's very hard to visualize 1,200 people or things. And it actually seems like a lot. Over 1,000 is a lot. That's actually the opposite of what Charles Stewart and Amber McReynolds were trying to convey in this report, where they were quoting data from the Heritage Foundation and basically making the point that actually this is a vanishingly small number, considering how many votes have been cast in this 20-year period. But that's not what most people will take away from this, because big numbers are kind of a problem. We don't have a very good sense of how big they actually are. So comparisons to real things can really help with this problem. We're going to detour. It's one of the many detours we're going to take away from political issues into a great example that has absolutely nothing to do with politics. Well, almost nothing. In 2011, some of you may remember, Starbucks introduced a new size of drink, and it was called the Trenta. They already had tall, grande, venti. Some of you may know that trenta means 30 in Italian. And the reason it's called that, just like venti, is that they're referring to the number of fluid ounces in the drink size. So health experts were absolutely appalled. They were like, 30 ounces, that is a crazy amount for one person to drink in one sitting, particularly of coffee. That's a lot of coffee, a lot of caffeine. But how many people can really visualize 30 fluid ounces? I know I cannot. Probably several of you cannot. Most people really have no idea what that actually means. So health experts and news outlets who were hoping to warn people needed to demonstrate the amount of liquid in real terms. That is, terms that are real to most people. So here is one example: the human stomach. Average capacity is 900 milliliters, or about 16 milliliters less than a Trenta drink. So in the chat, I would just love to hear, does this work for you? Does this cement the kind of size for you? Be honest. I really want you to be honest. You can just say yes or no. Okay, some people are saying yes, some no. Okay, great, excellent. Sort of, yeah, kind of, maybe, I'm not sure, not really, yeah. Okay, so I'll just say for myself, it doesn't really work. And the reason it doesn't is that, how big is my stomach? It's inside of me. I don't know how big it is. It seems small when I eat pizza. It seems huge when I skip lunch. So there was another version that I saw that I absolutely love, and I think works better for most people, which is this. Even if you don't drink wine, you probably do have a tangible idea of the size of a wine bottle. You could visualize it with some accuracy. Even better, we all have some associations with a wine bottle, namely that it's not very healthy for one person to drink an entire bottle of wine themselves in one sitting. So it's a very effective visual comparison that makes the point very real for people. So when we're talking about money or voters or anything else involving very large numbers, it's often impossible for non-experts to make meaning out of what we're saying. For example, $1 billion versus $1 trillion. Most people know that a trillion is bigger than a billion, and that is where it stops. It's very hard for most people to actually accurately compare those two numbers and make any real meaning out of it. So let's look at a couple of other examples of making big numbers real, not just 30 fluid ounces, but many, many larger numbers. So here's one not so serious example. The Economist illustrated the amount of time spent watching Gangnam Style, the music video on YouTube, by comparing it to the equivalent time to build various human-made constructions from around the world. This is a little bit silly, but it's an attempt to convey time scale. And I will say, even though I don't know if that I have like a super clear idea of how many hours people have spent watching Gangnam Style from this, I actually learned quite a bit about the relative time scales of building these different, human-made things. So I really like this example. A little bit silly. Here's a non-visual example from the land of money and politics. This is trying to illustrate the wealth of billionaire Michael Bloomberg in terms that regular people can understand. So this guy says Mike Bloomberg's $34 million ad buy. That's millions. Millions are also hard for people to really wrap their heads around. That is the equivalent of the typical American writing a check for $39. Now, I really love this comparison because most people have no idea how to visualize $34 million, but they definitely have a very strong association with two $20 bills. $39 means a lot to some people, to most people, and they can really visualize that. So let me show you two more examples. Illustrating wealth is a really common problem here because just the relative sizes of people's wealth and their buying power just defy most people's realistic understanding. So here are a couple of different takes on illustrating wealth by the really magnificent data artist Mona Chalabi. She did this piece in the New York Times called 9 Ways to Imagine Jeff Bezos' Wealth. So her second example here is cake slices that approximate the slivers of Jeff Bezos' wealth that could pay for other things like pre-K for every US child for a year, or free public transit for every New Yorker. So I really like this one. Also, I'm partial to cake, so I love this example in particular. But she also did another one, which is comparing the median US household net worth, which is about $118,000, to Jeff Bezos' net worth, which is $172 billion in some concrete terms. So one of the comparisons you can see here is the weight of a single peanut representing the median US household net worth versus a truckload of peanut butter, almost a ton of peanut butter, which represents Jeff Bezos, or the size of a white blood cell versus the length of a finback whale, or fingernail dust versus a 5'7" tall person. Now, Mona Chalabi is an artist, so she works in a very visual medium. And by the way, she has a wonderful Instagram account. I highly recommend you follow her. But you can just as easily make the same kind of comparisons verbally. So for example, if I were talking to a journalist about the need for policies such as raising taxes on the very wealthy, I might say something like, well, let's talk about how much wealth is enough. If you think of the median household net worth as 1 peanut, Jeff Bezos' net worth is a truckload of peanut butter, almost a ton. I think it's reasonable to expect the ultra wealthy to pay a little more into the society that has helped them to create such astronomical wealth, don't you? So this is just one example of how to draw a kind of visual representation, a visual comparison that is meaningful to most people. Now, going back to my data story about nukes women in the media, one thing that was missing here was making those numbers really real. So we saw a chart that's not very real for most people. And remember that I said it was 80% men to 20% women from this field quoted in the news. So what does that mean to most people? They know that 80 is bigger than 20, but it's kind of hard to grasp, like, what does that mean in real terms? So it's a ratio of 4 to 1. or 1 out of every 5 quotes are from women. So here is just one simple way that we could bring that home. In this version, this is kind of nonsense language, but all of the quotes from men are in green and all of the quotes from women are in purple. And it just illustrates how difficult it is for women to get a word in edgewise. So this is just one very simple way to make it a little more real for people. Now, the next question is, how does this relate to your audience? Even if we're making measurement analogies to make data real, the realness of the data has to be real to an audience. Jessica Holman, who is a computer scientist and a leading expert on how people receive and understand data, she points out 2 problems that we have to overcome when it comes to relatability. One of them is that the unit has to be reasonable. So if the weight of a bomb is equivalent to 200,000 ballpoint pens, that's not really helpful because no one carries around that many pens. And that's just another giant number that people have to visualize. The second thing is that the comparison has to be meaningful. If a bomb could destroy an area the size of Central Park, that's really only meaningful for people who live in New York or who have spent time there and can really visualize how big Central Park is. Otherwise, it's not meaningful to your audience. So a great example of making something relatable is a tool called NukeMap, which aims to show the size of the area that would be immediately affected by a nuclear bomb if one were to hit. And you can adjust both the type of nuclear bomb as well as the map onto which it's overlaid. So this one is Denver. I don't live in Denver, and this visualization isn't very meaningful to me. It kind of seems big, I guess. But I'm in San Francisco, as I mentioned at the top of this, and this makes it immediately clear to me. Basically, the entire city is wiped out by this bomb. And if you were talking to an audience in Washington, D.C., or Atlanta, or Portland, or Phoenix, you could make the number relatable to them by showing that area. So back to our data story about nukes women in the media, how do we make it relatable to our audience? Well, for now, I'll imagine that our audience is other nukes advocates, maybe men in the field. And we want to encourage them to recommend their female colleagues to journalists when journalists ask them for a quote or an interview. So what would make this data relatable to them? Again, a very simple example is if we take the same thing I did to make it real a few slides ago, but we just flip it. So now all of the same ratio applies, but the men are having a hard time getting a word in edgewise. And it helps them to kind of put themselves in their female colleagues' shoes for a minute and imagine what that experience might be like. Again, super simple example, but one that kind of makes it a little more relatable. The hardest part about talking about data in a compelling way is conveying why your audience should actually care. Now, my best advice to experts is to pretend that you're lying on a therapist's couch and cast your mind back a few years. Why did you get into this work? Why do you advocate for changes in the world? Really dig deep here. And then think about more recently, let's say Monday morning. Why did you get out of bed and go to work? What is so important about this issue? At first, this might not, again, seem like a data problem, but for most people, numbers are unemotional and unrelatable. So talking about data runs the risk of exacerbating those 2 problems, of making your issue sound unrelatable and unemotional. So one example of making it matter is connecting your data to and your message to children and parents and the future. So for example, we might say, instead of spending over $1 trillion on rebuilding our nuclear arsenal, we could spend the same amount to upgrade our schools, pay for Head Start, and provide healthcare for every child who needs it. Or we might say, we should be creating a democracy that works for future generations. Now, if you've been doing what you do for a long time, it can be hard for you to remember why you do what you do, and it can be even harder to remember to tell people why you do what you do. Because over time, we learn to focus on the what. We're steeped in this stuff. We take it for granted that this stuff really matters. We're surrounded by people who care as much as we do. The same can be true no matter what your job is, if you work in finance or HR or really any specialization. When we talk to non-experts, that is, people outside of our own professional circles, we really have to show them why they should care about what we care about. So going back to my data story from before, why does gender representation in media for this sector matter, or in any sector? Well, in this case, if Americans are only hearing from men, they're potentially missing some of the story, and they're definitely missing women's perspectives. If women are not hearing from other women on this issue, they may perceive it as something that's not for them, something incomprehensible to women, or simply something that they don't need to be engaged in. And public opinion research, another data story, including Rethink's own public opinion research, consistently shows that women are more likely than men to be persuaded by our messages, more likely to want to engage with the issue when they're introduced to it, and more likely to say they want to teach other people about the issue. But again, they have to be introduced to it. Women are also more likely to say, and this is true in polls regardless of the topic, that they have no opinion or they don't know about an issue, much more likely than men to say that. So this is an audience we want to be reaching, and women are the best way to reach other women. And representation matters because if you don't see yourself represented, you can begin to think of yourself as unimportant. Representation in the world signifies social existence, and absence means symbolic annihilation, which sounds very scary and creepy, but really important. So representation really matters. Okay, let's review, and then I'm going to give you a very brief activity. So we need to make data real for our audience. We need to make it relatable to them, and we need to make sure that they understand why it actually matters to them. So in the chat, I want you to take a swing at making something real or relatable or matter. I'm going to give you the same basic stats, the same poll, and I just want you to try it out. One of these things. How would we make this real? How would we make it relatable? Or how would we make it matter to an audience? All right. Starting to see a couple of answers filter in. I'll give you another half a minute or so. Great. Okay. Yeah. I'm seeing some ideas like, yeah, how old were you when you got married? Yep. Different kinds of coming out stories, and how does that change over time? Does it look different for different people, especially younger people? Yep. Something about like, you probably know one of these people, maybe many of them. Great. Oh, I like this little story about an individual person who came out at Thanksgiving. Yes. Tell a personal story. I love it. Excellent. Okay. These are great. Keep them coming. I'm gonna move us on, but I really love these. Okay. So in the first section, I mentioned that humans are visual first processors. We're really drawn to images, and we tend to think in pictures, even if we're not fully aware of that. Now, since numbers are abstract to most people, it's often important to show your data to your audience. Typically, we do this through charts and other kinds of data visualizations. So also in the chat, does anyone know who this is? I'm gonna just see. It's not important if you don't know, but does anyone recognize this face? Okay, I think maybe not. All right, so maybe some of you do, but this is fashion genius and Nazi collaborator Coco Chanel, founder of the Chanel house. For today, we're going to leave aside her political activities because she did have at least one really useful piece of fashion advice that we're going to actually adapt for our own purposes, which is before you leave the house, look in the mirror and take one thing off. In other words, less is more. I really enjoy the irony, by the way, that in this photo, she seems to be wearing approximately 50 necklaces, but never mind. We're going to leave that be. Okay, so many data visualizations suffer what I would call chart clutter, which really comes from a good place. We want to help our reader out. We're really excited about our data and we want them to see all of the things in this chart. But it's really cluttering up their ability to actually take in what you're trying to give them and interpret it correctly. Now, one major contributor to our chart clutter culture is good old Excel. Even though Clippy, the creepy paperclip, has gone away, fortunately, Excel defaults to different things on its chart tool, and they basically shove you into chart clutter land. It really takes a lot of work to eliminate that clutter, but it's really worth it to do so. And I'm going to show you what I mean with a real example. So here is a chart. I think we've all seen charts like this. They show up in PowerPoint decks, reports, even in academic articles. This is one that I recreated based on a chart from one of our partner organizations a few years ago. I will name no names, but it's about the quote, low yield Trident bomb. Really could be about anything, doesn't matter. But this chart is one that I recreated from a real one. So we're still in the world of fashion. So it's time for a makeover. Okay, here's the original chart on the left, and here is a new version of this chart. So I did a few things here. I will just very briefly tell you. I made it a flat two-dimensional column chart. I got rid of the legend, which was over here. I moved the title to the y-axis label, and I made the label light gray. I changed the y-axis. This is a little visual trick. I changed it so that it runs from 0 to 7,000 with tick marks every 1,500 units instead of every 1,000, so that the 6,500 actually stands out above the last tick mark. I also made the tick marks light gray and dashed so they kind of recede into the background a little bit visually. And I added data labels, very important, so that viewers have to do less work. Really important to note here, these two charts are exactly the same size. They are exactly the same size. But the one on the right, the kind of after version, just takes up, it has more presence on the page because the actual chart part of it is bigger and there's just less visually going on. So it really takes up a lot more of your space, of your visual field of vision. The version on the right, I would say, is clearer and it's easier to understand. The data really shines through the simplicity of it. However, we are not quite done with this transformation. So hold on to this thought. We're going to come back after this little detour, which is visualization is a really important part of presenting data because, we say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? The thing is, we're often trying to make our charts do the work of 5,000 words, and they usually become less effective when we do that. So when you're showing data, think about the one thing you want your audience to take away from the chart. It could be a conclusion, it could be asking a question, it could be an emotion, it could be the resolution to your story arc, it just depends. So here's an example of a chart, not from the Nukes field, from a different field, that I think does not have a one thing in it. What are we meant to take away from this chart? Is it that there's a diversity of opinions about fair courts? Is it that most people think people usually or sometimes receive fair outcomes from the courts, which are these two bigger pieces of the pie? Is it that pie charts are the worst? That is my takeaway. Maybe not yours. Pie charts are terrible. We can get into that offline another time. But a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but words really frame a picture. Visualization titles influence how people interpret, perceive bias in, and trust data visualizations. With that in mind, let's go back to our low yield chart. Now, thinking about what I wanted someone to get out of this chart, I made a few more changes. And so here's the final version of the makeover. I removed the tick marks and labels on the y-axis altogether, and I just let the data labels do all the work. And most importantly, I added back a chart title, but I made it do the heavy lifting. So it's no longer just telling you what the chart is of. It's telling the reader what they should get out of the chart. With this final version, the chart is even simpler. It's even cleaner, but it's also very clear what someone should be getting from it. Now, one thing I want to note here is that the audience for this chart was fairly knowledgeable about this topic, so the title is really jargon heavy. But you have to consider your audience's level of knowledge about the topic when you're deciding how to present something, especially how to label it. It's not really about whether your audience is smart or feeling like you have to dumb down a topic. It's about how much expertise your particular audience has about the specific topic that you're talking to them about. And then basically adapting what you're telling them and how you're telling it to them to their level of knowledge, their level of expertise. Finally, one of the best ways to draw people into a data story is to help them find themselves. This works really well in an interactive data viz context like NukeMap. The idea of NukeMap itself is to show familiar geographical areas and give people an idea of how big a nuclear blast would be in a context that they actually understand and maybe are intimately familiar with. The New York Times data viz team uses this method a whole lot. As does the Pew Research Center. Often those two teams and quite a few others will present some findings like from a poll or a study, and then they invite readers to take a quiz or enter a little bit of information and see how they stack up against the reported findings. Now, there are lots of ways to do this to pull your audience in. You can use maps or geography like we've just showed. You could use a calculator. You could use birth year. I think actually somebody mentioned this in the chat. You could use race or gender or other identity or affinity groups. Now, this version, this was made by Jeremy Ashkenas in the New York Times, is a way of pulling you into yet another story about the minimum wage. It's kind of like doing a quiz, and many people you can't even help yourself. Like, you just have to take the quiz. You have to enter these pieces of fairly generic but personal information. Now let's see one more example, again from the New York Times, because they just do this really brilliantly. In this case, this is an article about how birth year affects political views. And it's about a model by researchers at Catalyst, which is the Democratic data firm, and partnering with Columbia University to estimate how people's preferences change at different stages of their lives. And what they find is that events that happen at or around age 18 are 3 times as powerful as those that happen at age 40 in influencing someone's political party preference and their voting behavior. So this is a cool graph that pretty well illustrates, what you want to know from the study. But the New York Times takes the model and they allow readers to splash around in the data, to see themselves in it, or to see their parents or maybe their grandparents. So this might be a reader where they entered their birth year. Let's say they were age 27 in 2012. This might be the reader's parent. And this might be the reader's grandparent. And giving the reader the opportunity to kind of enter their own information and see how this might have affected themselves or people in their direct family or their circle of friends or whatever can be really powerful in cementing the conclusion of the study. So, final review, take one thing off, less is more, get rid of chart clutter, Also, identify the one thing that you want your readers to really be getting out of a data visualization. And this actually applies even if it's not a visual representation. What is the one thing you want people to take away? And then, if possible, try to figure out how someone can see themselves in your data, in your numbers. It's a very powerful way of making something, again, real, relatable, relevant to the individual, and it cements things in a very different way. So we have a few minutes for questions. And again, if you can enter those into the Q&A, that would be great. I will ask Adrian to just keep an eye on that. And while you're maybe scribbling in some questions, I'll just again mention the final webinar in this series will be next week at the same time, 1 week from today. And it will be talking about how to use polls in your media and communications work. Adrian and one of our colleagues are going to lead that. I think it's a great session, and it kind of brings together the two preceding sessions in this series into, the whole thing, why this really matters, because we actually want to communicate effectively about this. So with that, I don't know if there are any questions coming up. Yeah, I'll mention also, we will send the recording in a follow-up email. And if you missed the last session, just get in touch with us. You can email this email address, analysis@Rethink Media, or whatever, whoever reached out to you with the invitation to this session. Just reach out to one of us and we'll get you that information, that recording, and some additional resources. Okay.
So Eva, we have a question from Cheryl asking how important it is to use color in your charts.
Oh, great question. So this is like my very social sciencey answer. It depends. I would say that it's not crucial to use color, but it can be very helpful to use it. I think that the big danger with using color is overusing it. Just like any other kind of chart clutter, having a ton of different colors in your chart can actually detract from how easy it is for someone to understand what you're trying to convey with your chart. But the judicious use of color can also really illuminate things about what you're trying to describe. So, I would say when in doubt, again, less is more. The other thing about color to bear in mind is that there are some accessibility questions that you have to answer, or just things you have to be aware of. So there are some really wonderful resources online for example, color blindness and which colors don't contrast enough with each other, so that folks who have color blindness or other kind of color sight issues might have trouble, or screen readers sometimes have trouble differentiating. So those are the kinds of things that you want to just keep in mind. But it's very simple to check those. I think the big takeaway is judicious use of color can be enormously valuable, but don't go overboard.
And we have another question here. Tough question. What's your advice for representing the $1.5 trillion annual military budget, given the difficulty of grasping $1 trillion or even million, billion, all of that?
Yeah. It's not an easy question. So thank you for this question. And it's not easy. I think that one thing we've seen with these kinds of questions is that the most effective way to talk about them is to talk about how that money could be used in a different way, or what kinds of things it could pay for. So, I gave some examples of, like, instead of spending this much on X, defense spending or weapons or a plane or whatever, instead we could use that money to pay for, healthcare for every child in the United States, or Head Start for every, under 3-year-old, or, whatever, however we want to put it. So those kinds of things can be really helpful. We often refer to those sorts of comparisons as like guns versus guns or guns versus butter. And which way you go with them kind of depends on your target audience and how they feel about defense spending or any other kind of spending that you're talking about. But I typically steer people toward thinking about like how you could use that money in a different way that would convey the largeness of the number, but also give them some additional kind of texture to what you're really trying to convey, which is usually that we're spending way too much and we should be redirecting that money. Or, another way to go is if we spent half that money, every person in the United States who pays taxes would get $500 back or whatever. Something like that, even if you don't want to redirect the spending, but you actually want to just spend less, that can also be really powerful to just give them, again, a real like tangible sense of what does this money mean to me personally or to my family or to my community, for example. Yeah, I see this other possible answer, which is type out the trillion with all its zeros, which I also love. Yeah, maybe one last question, if there is one.
I see a question in the chat about what about when research reveals data to be zero? For instance, looking at immigration relief programs have about a dozen programs with 0 of the 54 Africans that have ever qualified.
Interesting. Okay. I don't have like a super immediate answer to that. But I would really love it if you emailed us that question so we could think about it a little more and respond. And I'll just say that goes for any other questions that you have. Please feel free to send them to us. These are the kinds of questions that we really love getting. Rethink is very happy to help you, kind of think through how you're communicating about numbers and data, polls, but other things as well. And incorporating them into your messaging or thinking about, does this chart, does this data visualization convey what I want it to convey? We are all about communicating more effectively to our target audiences. And if you're not sure who your audience is, that is also something that we can help you identify. So I see that we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. You're going to get a follow-up email in the next day or so with the recording and some other kind of links to different things that I talked about in today's session. And we really hope that you'll join us next week for the final part of this series, which is about how to use polls in your media and comms work. Thank you so much.